A Roman general, wealthy, powerful, celebrated, stands at the edge of the Mesopotamian desert. Behind him, 40,000 of the finest soldiers the ancient world has ever produced. Disciplined, armored, undefeated across 3 continents. He isn't afraid. Why would he be? Rome has never lost. Not to Carthage. Not to Greece. Not to any kingdom foolish enough to plant itself in the legion's path. And the territory ahead, dusty, flat, shimmering with heat. His name is Marcus Licinius Crassus. The year is 53 BCE, and he is about to walk into the worst military disaster Rome has ever suffered. He will not walk out. Welcome to Ancient Ledger. Today, we're going deep into one of history's most overlooked empires, Parthian. A kingdom so formidable that it held Rome to a standstill for nearly 3 centuries. An empire that defeated Roman legions again and again. An empire that Roman historians struggle to describe, because it operated by rules Rome had never encountered. And before we're done today, you'll understand exactly why Rome feared it, and why history, somehow, has nearly forgotten it. To understand where Parthia came from, we need to rewind the clock to the world that made it possible. It's the 3rd century BCE. Alexander the Great has been dead for decades, and his vast conquests have fractured into competing kingdoms. One of the most powerful is the Seleucid Empire, a sprawling domain stretching from modern Syria to the edges of Central Asia. The Seleucids inherited Alexander's ambition and administrative machinery, but they also inherited his impossible challenge, governing an empire too large. On the fringes, in the northeastern provinces, near Modande, Turkmenistan, lives a semi-nomadic people known as the Parni. They are horse people, steppe warriors, riders who grow up in the saddle and measure wealth in herds and mobility. To the refined Greek administrators of the Seleucid court, they are little more than a border nuisance. That is a mistake. Around 247 BCE, a Parni leader named Arsaces makes his move. The Seleucid Empire is distracted, stretched thin across too many fronts. Arsaces sees the opportunity and seizes it. He crosses into the province of Parthia, a fertile region east of the Caspian Sea. He drives out the Seleucid governor. He declares independence, iti sagamble. A bold, almost reckless act, but Arsaces survives, and in surviving, he plants the seed of something remarkable. This moment marks the birth of the Arsacid dynasty. Now, at first glance, this new kingdom doesn't look like much. It's small. It's provincial. It sits far from the great cities. But the Parthians possess something that raw size and wealth cannot buy: adaptability. The Parthians are not rigidly one thing. They are not purely nomadic. They are not purely Persian aristocrats. Their rulers adopt Persian royal traditions, the ancient titles, the ceremonial gravity, connecting themselves to a commended memory. At the same time, they absorb Greek administrative practices, using the machinery of Hellenistic governance to run their territories. And underneath it all, they never lose the cavalry instincts of their steppe origins. The mobility, the speed, the ruthless tactical flexibility. This hybrid identity is not a weakness. It is their greatest weapon. Other kingdoms in the ancient world tend toward rigidity. One culture, one way of fighting. Parthia refuses that limitation, and that refusal is exactly what will allow a small frontier kingdom to eventually challenge the mightiest military force the world has ever seen. A kingdom is not an empire. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Kingdoms hold ground. They defend borders. They survive. But empires expand. They consume, absorb, and remake the world around them. The leap from one to the other requires something more than ambition. It requires the right leader, at the right moment, with the right vision. For Parthia, that leader arrived around 171 BCE. His name was Mithridates I. When Mithridates ascended the Parthian throne, the empire was still a regional power, significant within its corner of the Iranian plateau. The Seleucid Empire, though weakened, still dominated much of the Middle East. Rome was rising rapidly in the west. The great game was being played. Mithridates intended to change that. He was not a king who waited for opportunity. He manufactured it. Over his long reign, he pushed Parthian borders. He swept westward into Media, the ancient heartland of northwestern Iran, folding it into the Parthian domain. He drove south into Babylonia, capturing some of the oldest and wealthiest cities: Seleucia on the Tigris, Ecbatana, and the ancient streets of Babylon itself, still famous and grand. These were not mere military victories, they were statements. Each conquest carried symbolic weight. By seizing Mesopotamia, Mithridates wasn't just enlarging his kingdom, he was claiming an inheritance. And he made that claim explicit. Mithridates adopted the title Shahansyah, King of Kings, the same as Cyrus the Great. The message was deliberate. Parthia was not a successor to Alexander's Hellenistic world. Parthia was the resurrection of Persia. By the 1st century BCE, Parthia had become one of the two dominant powers. Its territory stretched from the Euphrates to Central Asia, and directly to the west, expanding with terrifying speed, was Rome. The two empires were on a collision course. Perhaps it was inevitable. Two powers of that magnitude, sharing a border, each accustomed to dominance, were never going to coexist peacefully for long. Rome's military dominance rested on the legion, heavy infantry in disciplined formations, advancing behind interlocked shields, breaking lines through organized force. Roman soldiers were some of the most coordinated fighters produced. Their system had been tested against Carthage, Macedon, and the tribes of Gaul, but it had a vulnerability. It was designed for an opponent who stood and fought against an enemy who refused to stand still. Strengths became uncertainties. Parthia had built an army that was the perfect counter. Their forces were dominated by two types of cavalry. First, the horse archers. They were capable of firing volleys at full gallop. Second, the cataphracts, heavily armored shock cavalry, horse and rider encased in layered metal. These two forces worked in terrifying combination. The horse archers exhausted the enemy. The cataphracts finished the job. Rome was about to find out. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the wealthiest private citizen in Roman history. He was clever, calculating, and relentlessly ambitious. He was part of the first triumvirate, with Caesar and Pompey. Both had earned military glory. Crassus wanted his own. He wanted Parthia. In 54 BCE, he marched into Mesopotamia with 40,000 troops. His officers warned him. The terrain was unfamiliar. Crassus dismissed every concern. Near the town of Kirrhae, the armies met. What the Romans encountered was not a battle they recognized. Horse archers flooded across the flat desert plain. The legions formed their testudo, the famous tortoise formation. Shields locked overhead. It was designed to weather missile, fire, and weight. The Parthians did not close. They simply kept shooting, hour after hour. Under a merciless sun, arrows hammered the Roman lines. When Roman cavalry tried to chase them, the Parthians simply rode away, then turned in the saddle and fired behind them as they fled. When the Romans were sufficiently broken, the cataphracts came. The slaughter was enormous. More than 20,000 Roman soldiers died at Kirrhae. Crassus himself was killed during a disastrous attempt at negotiation. The eagle standards of Rome's lost legions were carried east as trophies. Rome was stunned. Not since Hannibal had an enemy done this to a Roman army. And unlike Hannibal, Parthia wasn't going anywhere. Not its armies. Not its treasury. Not even, ultimately, its pride. Rome had a long tradition of absorbing humiliation and returning with interest. What Kirrhae broke was an assumption, a foundational belief, so deeply held that most Romans had never even thought to question it. The belief that Rome was simply better organized, better disciplined, better led, better equipped for the work of conquest. For generations, that belief had been confirmed by every victory. Every enemy kingdom that folded under the weight of the legions. Kirrhae said otherwise. And so, for the next 3 centuries, Rome would keep returning to the eastern frontier, not with confidence, but with something more complicated. A need to settle the question, to prove that Kirrhae was an anomaly, a fluke, a single bad day in a desert that didn't count. Parthia, every single time, refused to cooperate. The conflict after Kirrhae falls into a pattern that repeats with almost rhythmic consistency. Rome invades. Rome achieves early success. Rome discovers that holding Parthian territory is an entirely different proposition from seizing it, and Rome, eventually, withdraws. Mark Antony launched one of the most ambitious eastern campaigns in 36 BCE. He commanded over 100,000 men. He struck deep into Parthian territory, reaching the Median highlands. And then the campaign unraveled. His siege equipment was destroyed by a Parthian raiding force. Supply lines collapsed. His army was harassed, constantly, by Parthian cavalry. Antony lost nearly a third of his forces without ever winning a decisive engagement. He returned to the west in defeat. Even the Emperor Trajan, one of Rome's greatest military minds, could not solve the Parthian problem. In 114 CE, Trajan launched a massive campaign. He captured Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, and stood on the shores of the Persian Gulf. But within 2 years, the conquered territories were in open revolt. Roman garrisons were overwhelmed. The cities slipped back into Parthian hands. Trajan died on the journey home, his great Eastern Empire dissolving behind him. The Euphrates remained the border. It always came back to the Euphrates. To understand why Parthia was so impossible to permanently defeat, you have to understand how it was actually built very differently from Rome. Rome was centralized. Its power flowed from the capital outward through a dense network of law, roads, and standing armies loyal to the emperor. This system produced incredible efficiency. It also meant that when the center was threatened, everything trembled. Parthia worked almost in reverse. The Arsacid kings ruled through a network of powerful noble houses, semi-autonomous regional lords. The Arsacid king sat above this system, but he did not micromanage it. He governed through alliance, negotiation, and the distribution of prestige. To Romans, this looked like instability, but this decentralized structure gave Parthia something Rome could not easily replicate: resilience. When a city fell, the noble houses retreated to their estates. The cavalry dispersed across the steppe. The king moved his court. There was no single point of failure. Rome could win battles indefinitely. It could not win the war, because Parthia simply would not stay defeated. There was another dimension to Parthian power that Roman legions could never touch: the Silk Road. Parthia sat at the center of the ancient world's greatest trading network, connecting China in the east to Rome in the west. Every bundle of silk, every bag of spices, every shipment of stones traveled roads that Parthian kings taxed and controlled. This made Parthia extraordinarily wealthy, but it also made it a meeting place of cultures, languages, religions, and ideas. Persian nobles rubbed shoulders with Greek merchants, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, and early Christians all moved through Parthian cities. The Chinese called the Parthians the Yangtze. Roman merchants who dreamed of direct trade with China were firmly blocked by a Parthian Empire that understood its value. Parthia was the gatekeeper of the world, and yet, even the greatest empires carry within them the seeds of their own undoing. By the early 3rd century CE, Parthia was fraying. The noble houses had grown powerful enough to become a liability. Rival Arsacids fought with increasing bitterness. Wars with Rome drained resources. The social contract that held the federation together was loosening. And in the southern province of Persis, Ardashir was watching. Ardashir came from a line of priest-kings who governed. He was regal and ambitious, ready to forge a new empire from the ashes.